Greetings, dregs of YouTube. In this video, I'm going to be discussing how I went about replacing the motor mounts on my Toyota Tacoma. This is a 2011, so it's a second gen. This is a four-wheel drive model. This process, I believe, should apply pretty much the same for most second gens. If you have a two-wheel drive model, this will be considerably easier. So, just a couple other things before we get started. This is a fairly involved, difficult job. I'm not a professional mechanic, so don't take anything you hear in this video as the absolute best way to do this. If you don't feel comfortable doing something like this, I would not recommend doing it because there are several opportunities to potentially cause some serious damage to your vehicle. So just a disclaimer. With that out of the way, let's get into how I went about doing this. I'm making this video because I spent days trying to find something like this before I did this and really couldn't find much. So hopefully this will help somebody. So with all that out of the way, the first thing you're going to want to do is disconnect the brake lines on both the driver and the passenger side. They're held in with two 12mm bolts. One of them goes up here, and one of them down here. These little brackets kind of clip into holes in the frame, like that. So you just unbolt them, wiggle the clips out, and then you can get this brake line a little bit out of the way so you can get into the bolts. Then, the next thing you're going to want to do is loosen the three motor mount bolts on each side. You can kind of see them through here. Something else you might want to do on the passenger side, there's this cable here, if I can manage to point to it without getting in the way. It's just taped on here, and it's in a very annoying spot, so I just went ahead and cut that tape, and I'm gonna retape it after I finish filming this video. So you need to loosen the three bolts. You can see them here. There's one there, and there. The two on the sides are 14mm. The big one in the middle is a 17mm. You'll notice that one of my bolts is actually a 15mm and is brand shiny and new. That's because it's very easy to drop one of these bolts in the frame as you're trying to get them off. Clearance is very annoying here, and I ended up dropping one. So something you might want to do is just pick yourself up a couple flange nuts before starting this. That way you don't have to rush out in the middle of doing this while your vehicle is undrivable. If you're curious, that's what I bought from Home Depot. So you could just pick up some of that if you want to have a couple extra. It's a couple dollars. It's good insurance. So you'll need to crack these loose. I was able to sneak a breaker bar and a short socket in there to get the initial break on the bolts, and then I just used ratcheting wrenches to get them out the rest of the way. You might be able to do something different, but that's just what I did. So you'll need to do this on this side and also on the driver's side. I can show you what that looks like. In general, the driver's side is the more annoying side for this. The lighting's not super good, but you can kind of see them there. So once you have all of these nuts and bolts taken completely off, you don't need to worry about supporting the engine or anything just yet, because the weight of the motor itself will keep everything on until you're ready to start jacking the engine up. And again, there's two bolts on this brake line here. Same deal. One other thing you might want to consider doing before this is getting some of your transmission-esque things out of the way. I'm doing this after finishing a clutch replacement, and I found that the extra clearance from not having the Y-pipe in or the front drive shaft is very helpful. Again, if you have a two-wheel drive, you won't have a front drive shaft, and this should be considerably easier. But I would recommend disconnecting some of the transmission wiring harnesses, taking the front drive shaft off, and just clearing up this space, because you're going to need to be reaching up through here to get at the bolts and to wiggle the mounts in and out. So once you have those bolts on each side removed, then you can start jacking up the engine to clear the threads on that 17mm bolt. I did not want to remove these brackets attached to the engine because that seemed like a lot more work than needed to be done. I know some people have taken both pieces of this motor mount out and then put in aftermarket ones. I'm not doing that. I'm just putting in factory motor mounts. But the next step is going to be to clear that big thread. I can show you in more detail what this looks like on some of the old mounts here. So you need to get that bracket that attaches to the engine to lift up enough to clear this thread. And that's the 17. Those two are the 14s. So in order to jack the engine up, I did it in 2 stages. I can hop under the truck and show you exactly what. So after you remove the rear splash guard, rock guard, whatever you want to call it, I didn't need to take the front one off. You should only need to take the back one off. The first jacking maneuver that I did was to put a block of wood on the oil pan to the passenger side of the drain plug, so over here. This part can be a little bit risky. You don't want to damage your oil pan. I didn't have any trouble doing it this way, but this is a potentially risky part of this job. So you get your block of wood in here somewhere and start jacking that up. And what is going to happen is, because this side of the oil pan is a little bit off center, the engine's going to sort of rotate like that, which is going to make it very easy to get the passenger side motor mount out. Something else that I did is, you can see here I have the transmission completely disconnected from the cross member and the frame, that is, and I have a second jack here under the transmission. This was super helpful to be able to raise the entire engine transmission system up in a level fashion, and avoid pinching any brake lines or anything. So get your block of wood in there on the oil pan, start jacking that up little bit by little bit, level it out with the transmission jack, and work that up very slowly. I went like 1/4 inch at a time, small motions. Make sure you're checking under the hood to be sure you're not squishing some line or some cable or something. And then once you have that motor mount, let me see if I can get an angle in there. Once you have that bracket up enough that it can clear those threads, then you should be able to just reach up in there, lift the motor mount off of those tongs on the back, and swivel it out through this opening here. And then stick the new one back in, or whatever you're going to do. And then what I did is I lowered the truck back down, or the engine back down, and tightened the bolts on the new passenger side motor mount just a little bit. I just threaded the nuts on just enough that they were threaded on. The reason I did that is I didn't want to have to try to line 2 motor mounts up at once, so I kept that loosely snugged on while I did the driver's side. If you use this jack point, you won't need to worry about leaving nuts on the driver's side, because it's going to rotate that way slightly, and is just going to stay on the driver's side motor mount naturally. You won't have to do anything. So once you have the new one on, and those nuts just spun on a few threads, then what I did is I used a ratchet strap and went around this point here on the exhaust on the passenger side through this frame here next to where the transmission crossmember goes. The reason for that is that when you try to jack this up, even in a more centralized jack point, the engine seems to want to go that way, which makes it very difficult to get the driver's side out unless you have something kind of pulling it the other direction. So then I just took a punch. I mean, you could use a drill bit or whatever, or do this while you're doing an oil change and take the drain plug out, but I made a little indent in the block of wood so that I could fit it over the oil plug like that. So we're sort of on a different part of the oil pan now, this side, and to avoid putting pressure on that drain plug. If you're doing this in the middle of an oil change, you wouldn't have to worry about this, but I didn't want to risk putting too much pressure on that plug. So when you have the block here, this is going to be much closer to the center line than over here. So the engine should come up a little bit straighter, but you'll still need that ratchet strap. And then you're going to do basically this same idea of jack this up a little bit, move the transmission up a little bit. You want to move them kind of as a system. Front side a little bit, back side a little bit. And then once you get that up and up, you can do the same thing over here. Let me see if I can get you a better angle. It's difficult to see. The motor mount is in there. And it's a very similar idea, except the driver's side is a lot more annoying because you have a lot of extra stuff in the way. But jack it up slowly, sneak the motor mount out, put the new one back in. And then one thing that I did with the driver's side is I jacked the engine down just enough to have the bracket center itself on the threads, but not all the way down. And that way I could line the bolts up properly. Once you have all of the weight back down, you need to make sure that all of your bolts are centered, because you're not really going to be able to move the mount at all once the weight of the powertrain's on it. So I jacked the engine down very slightly, got the bolts in the right place, started to tighten them down a little bit, then jacked it down the rest of the way. And then once you have it down the rest of the way, just tighten the bolts back up, and don't forget to reattach your brake line, which I have not done yet. But that's about all there is to it. But this was a very annoying job. Don't really have a lot of clearance at any point, so just know what you're getting yourselves into. Anyways, if you found this video helpful, instead of bothering with liking and subscribing or any of that YouTube nonsense, I would ask that you send this along to anywhere that you think someone in need of a video like this might find it. Thank you very much for watching.